Globalization is one of these big things that has impacted corporations and their performance almost everywhere. And what's sort of surprising is that what globalization turned out to be, more recently, is quite different from what we anticipated when we started to see it and observe the integration of markets around the late 70s, early 80s. Then globalization was thought of a process whereby the world would become a market, so to speak, that markets that were national would integrate, would agglomerate, will become worldwide, which would give tremendous advantages to companies, in particular multinationals from the West, that had huge scale. And of course, they were joined a bit later on by multinationals from Japan. And so the famous triad was supposed to be the source of all these companies that could one day dominate the world because of their scale and sheer size, serving global markets. Now, what happened was that as time went by and as technology progressed, in particular the technology of communication and transportation across countries, we saw an exponential growth of connections, not just connections at the country level or at the organizational level, the company level, institutional level, but also at the individual level. And the internet kind of nailed globalization. So the cumulative effect of all the trade, the global supply chains and so forth that we have seen over the last 40 or 50 years was interacting all the time with this increased ability for individuals to communicate, be it individuals inside companies or individuals outside company. This gave rise to an emerging global world, to the world as a whole, i.e. a truly global world, which is far more complex than what global markets were supposed to be. And in this global world, we see a few features that are somewhat surprising and also have tremendous implications for performance and for governance. And I want to focus in one of these today. So let's focus on the following. The more the world is global, the more the local matters. This observation comes from comparing the performance of multinational companies in different countries recently, and in particular to observe that in many quote-unquote emerging market economies such as China or Brazil or Indonesia or Turkey or elsewhere, in industries where protection and unfair competition is not really there, we saw local companies win relative to the multinationals that were supposed to lead everywhere in industries or markets such as ice cream or domestic appliances or, for example, internet commerce. And what we found out by observing this is that there were a number of factors that could account for this sort of extraordinary occurrence. And the first one is that local companies are now able to leverage the world's technologies and knowledge at home in ways that they couldn't do before. First, because they can use global markets that have been enacted over the years, often by Western multinationals, in their attempt to outsource components, modularized designs, offshore manufacturing, because by doing that, global markets were created for components, for technologies, for contract manufacturing, which a local company can now access and can now benefit from. But local companies everywhere can also benefit from global markets in services, services such as design, engineering, advertising, strategy consulting, financial advice, and so forth. And of course, they can also hire the same talent or have access to the same talent pools that anyone can, not just by, for example, employing their own compatriots that went abroad to learn and be trained in universities or business schools, such as INSEAD, or because they hire either locals or foreigners that have years and years and years of experience in their industries, often coming from leading multinational companies. And what these experienced managers bring is not just their knowledge, their individual knowledge about the business, about the technical side or market side of the business, but they also bring the connections, the personal networks, the social capital that will be a tremendous source for the company. So basically, in a global world, local companies can now access the same kind of resources everywhere, in particular intangible resources, that any leading multinational either obtained in their home country or also from being around the world. This, by the way, means that the more the world is global, the more the traditional multinationals lose their advantage, contrary to what was imagined a few decades ago. Because, as I mentioned earlier, a global world is actually something very complicated and different from what a global market seemed to be. So that is the first cause for this local performance being so remarkable and able to compete successfully with foreign multinationals that come and that are used to dominate markets. There is a second advantage that local companies have, in particular in emerging markets. And that has to do well with the nature of an emerging market. Of course, emergence doesn't mean simply growth. It actually means sometimes not growing. But what emergence means, of course, is a transformation, a deep transformation of the local environment. And that transformation means that there are constant shifts, sometimes back and forth, in regulations, in the behavior of suppliers or the behavior of competitors, or the behavior and preferences of customers and consumers. What that means, of course, is that there are constant, quick shifts, changes in local marketplaces under these conditions of emergence. And multinationals there have often to rely on the approval of headquarters for some adaptation, while local firms are able to turn quickly on a dime. And therefore, what happens is that if the market is changing constantly, adapting to the market is, of course, a second best choice. And so that's another reason, this inability to adapt quickly to an emerging market, i.e. an unpredictable market, that favor local companies, and in particular entrepreneurial companies, relative to the large multinationals that have to rely on a more complex and more complicated governance system for decision making relative to what they can do in those local markets. So there's still a third factor of local success, and that is a dynamic advantage. Emerging markets, developing countries, go through very complex transformations, many smaller transformations, sometimes bigger transformations. And what local companies can do, and often do, in particular leading local companies, is that they shape the future of their countries. They participate actively and emotionally in the development of their own countries. And by doing so, they are shaping the field as they play in the field. And of course, if one is a foreign team and is only trying to play without noticing that the field is changing because the home team is changing it, that creates a very, very difficult set of conditions for competing effectively. So multinationals will need, if they want to be present in an emerging market, for example, to actively engage in the development of that market. What this means, for example, is to observe what local companies in many of these markets have done, and some multinationals have done too. So, for example, to engage with distributors or customers and train them in the use of a new product or new service, to partner with local suppliers and co-create with the local suppliers, for example, components or services that are necessary and that they may not be ready to deliver, to train local people, even to work with government in the preparation of new regulations, or to speak in public. And we've seen this. Several charismatic entrepreneurs in these countries speak publicly about not just their company, but what their company is doing for the country. And they mean it, by the way. It is their home country. Let's not forget that. So unless multinationals are able to also engage actively and at least be part of this very dynamic process, there will always be several steps behind the local leading companies. So in order to overcome these challenges that local companies present to foreign multinationals, namely in emerging markets, what many multinationals will probably need to do is the following: to shift the managerial mindset at headquarters and at the corporate board level, to one that recognizes that local integration cannot be piloted from the center, as local adaptation might be. Companies will need to upgrade the role and the caliber of local managers so that they are active players in their countries. And thirdly, the role of local boards of directors needs to be dramatically augmented too. Often companies have local boards, but these local boards are there for legal reasons or other institutional reasons. They don't play a big role. Well, they need to play a big role. They need to play a role that takes into account that local constituencies need to participate and that the company needs to participate in development of the local society. This, of course, will impact also the relationship between the corporate board and the local boards, as it will impact the relationship between the head office and the local offices. And these changes in structures and processes will surely have a positive impact on the performance of multinationals everywhere in the world as a result of a more and more global world.